Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. Feral people, one of the most persistent legends tied to the Appalachian Mountains and far beyond. There are countless stories and first-hand accounts from people who've gone deep into the mountains and come back with chilling descriptions of human-like figures, but with something undeniably wild still clinging to them. I'll admit, I've always been skeptical about this topic, but since starting Horror Spectator and digging deeper, talking directly to people and reading the stories you've sent in, I'm not so sure anymore. In this video, we meet two people who, like me, used to think feral people were nothing more than a spooky story meant to keep folks out of the woods. But after what they experienced, they can't say that anymore. As always, thank you so much for being here and for keeping this channel alive. Your support means more than you could ever imagine. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. Back in the summer of 1986, I was about 37 and going through a major shift in my life. I'd served in the Marine Corps, then spent several years as a police officer in Pennsylvania. After burning out from both, I felt this pull towards something quieter, something simpler. I wanted solitude, space to breathe, and to be surrounded by nature. So I packed up my things and moved out to rural West Virginia. No grand plan. I just needed to be closer to the woods. I know that might sound like a strange decision to most people, but if you knew what I'd been through, and trust me, that's not something I can explain in a few words. It would probably make a lot more sense. When I told my former colleagues and the few distant relatives I still spoke to about the move, no one questioned it. They accepted it without hesitation. It just seemed fitting. After about 6 months living out there, I'd picked up part-time work doing security and odd jobs for the county. Nothing too intense. Most of my free time was spent hiking deep into the mountains, especially around a remote stretch of land up in the Monongahela National Forest. I'd become a little obsessed with a particular ridgeline that most folks avoided. It wasn't marked on any hiking trail. No signs, just raw wilderness. The kind of place where the deeper you go, the more the trees seem to swallow up your presence. Once again, it might sound a little unsettling to some people, but that feeling, that sense of being small beneath those ancient trees, was exactly what I was looking for. That day started off perfect. Warm sun, barely any wind, and the air had that clean, crisp smell you only get up high in the hills. I hadn't planned on hiking, but I got off work early, and something about the weather pulled me in. There was a spot about 2 hours up the slope I'd only been to once before, years earlier, back when I hadn't even imagined living in West Virginia, with a close friend who had since passed away while serving in the military. When you spend enough time in those circles, you sort of get used to losing people, no matter how old they are. Most of the time, they're just gone, and you never really learn what actually happened. But anyway, at that particular moment, it felt like as good a time as any to hike back out there. I grabbed my old compass and a paper map. I didn't have a GPS back then, and headed out in my Jeep toward a dead-end dirt road near the edge of the forest. From there, I hiked in. Again, no trail, just forest and elevation. The climb was rough. A lot of dense underbrush, loose rock, and barely any light breaking through the trees in some parts. After about 2 hours, I hit a slope that didn't feel right, It was way too narrow and clearly unstable. I pulled out my map, studied the lines, and saw a nearby clearing off to the side that looked like it ran parallel to the ridge I was aiming for. I figured it might be safer and possibly faster if I cut over. Even with my experience, I was out there alone, and I didn't want to risk something going wrong with no one knowing where I was and no way to call for help. Before moving on, I stopped by a stream to drink and cool off. As I splashed water on my face, I got that odd feeling, like someone was watching. I stood up, wiped my hands off, and pulled out my compass to reset my bearings. That's when I saw them. Up to my right, maybe 20 or 30 feet above me, on a small rocky ledge, partially hidden behind a pine tree, there was a figure. At first, I thought it was just another hiker, or maybe a hunter. But something about the way they stood, still, head slightly tilted, not blinking, it unsettled me. Their clothes were what struck me most, if you could call them clothes, looked more like scraps. Layers of mismatched fabric, possibly animal hide. Their hair was long, dark, and tangled, falling well past their shoulders. Their face was weathered and pale, but I couldn't make out the eyes. Still, I knew they were looking at me. I didn't say a word, just stared back. I felt frozen, almost in shock. And I think what unsettled me the most, beyond their appearance, was how pale their skin was. It looked almost like there wasn't a single drop of blood left in their body. I've spent a lot of time in the woods. I've run into hermits, drunks, even squatters. But this person didn't fit any of that. They looked disconnected, like they'd been out there far longer than any sane person should be. But at the same time, it didn't really look like a person. It had the shape of one, sure. But that skin was absolutely unreal. Then there was a slight movement, and my eyes adjusted, focusing past that first figure. Just behind it, partially covered by a larger bush, stood another one. But this time, I could see the eyes. They were this completely unnatural shade of blue. A blue so intense, it felt like it could cut straight through me. I know I probably sound crazy, but I swear, that's exactly what I saw. When I reached for my sidearm out of instinct, the figure stepped back and disappeared behind the tree. By the time I freed my holster and took aim, both of them were gone. More out of instinct from my previous jobs than anything else, I climbed up a nearby tree that had good footholds. From there, I could see the ledge clearly. There was no movement and no sound, just the forest. I sat up there for maybe 10 minutes, listening and watching, but nothing seemed alive. Then I realized even the usual forest sounds had stopped. One thing I knew for sure was that the woods go silent when a predator is nearby. Right then, I knew I needed to get out of there. Mostly because, without me even noticing, it was starting to get dark, and the last thing I wanted was to be alone in the dark with those creatures in their territory. I turned around, trying to retrace my path, when I heard a crack. Like wood splintering, followed by a deep crash. It sounded like the trunk of a tree splitting in half somewhere behind me. I stopped and listened, but the forest stayed silent. That was strange. I've heard trees fall naturally before, usually from wind or age, but this was different. It happened way too fast, and when I looked around, I didn't see anything broken. Then came the sound. It was like a giant rattlesnake was right there. It was like a snake making that noise. But to be that loud, It would have to be a giant snake. I looked toward the sound, and that's when I saw the two creatures I'd seen earlier, standing side by side, their heads tilted back, mouths open, making that noise. I felt frozen, completely paralyzed, until in the distance I saw another one just like them running toward the other two. And I realized everything. A hunt was about to start, and I was the prey. I fired a shot in their direction, more out of principle than anything else. And then I took off running like crazy through the forest. I knew they were going to catch me, and when I say my body was running, I'm not joking. I was certain I was done for. They were in their territory, and I was too far from my car. It was only a matter of time before they caught me and did God knows what. But my body wouldn't let me stop. I was all instinct, a primitive being acting purely on survival. I don't know how long I ran, but the only thing that saved me was finding a small river and throwing myself into it. I'd rather drown than die at the hands of those creatures. Somehow, for reasons I still don't understand, they stayed on the bank watching me get swept away by the current. And that's when my body just gave out. Literally. I don't remember anything after that until I woke up the next day, thanks to a hunter. Somehow, I'd made it to the shore, and he found me. He helped me up, and when I told him I was being chased by some kind of creatures, he didn't even hesitate. He just told me not to worry, that those things didn't come near this part of the forest, and that I was safe there. For 2 days, the hunter and his wife took care of me. They looked after me like I was some baby bird, feeding me soup and food to lift my spirits. 2 days later, the man took me to Babcock, a nearby village, and told me to forget the whole thing, that it wasn't worth dwelling on. And that's what I did. I spent the rest of my life trying to deny everything until now, when I feel old enough and don't want to die without passing on what I saw in those mountains. Believe it or not. This all happened at the beginning of the summer of 2023, and it completely changed one of the most important parts of my life. My name is Ken, and I've always loved the Smokey Mountains. I live relatively close to them, and for years I've done all kinds of hikes throughout the area. Over time, especially on Reddit and Facebook, I started noticing that a lot of people were becoming interested in hiking those trails, but many of them didn't have anyone to go with. Some were afraid, rightfully so, of venturing out alone, and ended up not going at all. That's when, back in 2018, I started organizing informal hikes. I'd gather small groups, usually no more than 8 people, and we'd explore different sections of the Smokies. Many times we'd spend several nights out there. It was one of the things in life that brought me the most peace and satisfaction. But in 2023, something happened. Something so disturbing I haven't stepped foot on those mountains since. People still ask me online when I'm going back. Until now, I've never told this story. Only the people who lived it and the police know the truth. It's important to say this. If you don't have experience, don't go into those mountains alone. Honestly, I think it's better to go with someone no matter how experienced you are. But if you're not prepared, just don't go. Those mountains are relentless, especially in the more remote areas. This time, there were 7 of us, plus a dog. It was the first time we had a dog with us, but I knew his owner, Matt. He'd hiked with me plenty of times, and his dog Spider was extremely well trained and used to climbing alongside him. We started out early on the first day, and by around 2 p.m., we had reached the area where we'd camp for the night. It was slightly off the main trail, but still close enough that we could get back to it within 5 minutes on foot. It was a beautiful clearing I'd visited countless times before. We weren't alone, though. Over the years, the clearing had become more well-known, and since it was summer, there was another family already camping there. We asked if they minded us joining them, and they immediately said no. They were 4, 2 parents, and their 2 daughters. The girls were instantly taken by Spider, and that night ended up being really pleasant. The next morning we said goodbye and continued on. They told us they'd likely follow the same path as us, but they'd only be leaving the next day since the girls, who were around 9 and 11, needed to rest more. We figured we might run into them again later, maybe on our way back down. The second day of hiking was uneventful. Spider was in a great mood, full of that kind of pure, innocent energy that only dogs seem to have. He ran from one side of the trail to the other, thrilled just to be out there. And honestly, his energy lifted everyone's spirits. But that night, everything changed. The spot we had planned to camp at turned out to be unsafe. A landslide during the previous winter had made the old path dangerous, so we changed course. Eventually, we found a nice area next to a small stream, peaceful and flat enough to set up camp. Everything was fine, until around 11 p.m. Some of us were still sitting near the water when Spider started acting weird. His fur stood up along his back, and he let out this low, steady growl. His whole body went stiff, staring directly across the stream into the trees. Matt, worried it might be an animal, immediately leashed him. Spider had never chased after anything before, not once, and had never reacted this way. Still, there's always a first time, and Matt wasn't about to take any unnecessary risks. We all stared in the direction Spider was focused on, but we couldn't see anything through the darkness and trees. Eventually, Matt led him back toward the tents to calm him down. I stayed behind for a moment, still scanning the trees across the stream. And that's when I saw something. Or someone. It looked like a person crouched down hiding. I couldn't be sure. It was too dark, and whatever it was wasn't moving at all. I tried to focus my eyes, but I started second-guessing myself. Maybe I was just seeing things, I told myself. I turned and walked back to the others. That night, sleeping was almost impossible. Not just because I was in the same tent as Matt and Spider was restless and on edge, but because sometime during the night, we heard footsteps near the tents. At first, we thought it might be one of us getting up to use the bathroom or something, but when I checked, all the tents were closed. Everyone was asleep. In the morning, I asked if anyone had gotten up during the night, and everyone said no. I told them I'd heard footsteps and immediately felt the shift in the group's mood. We all agreed it was time to move. During the hike that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I didn't know if it was just paranoia or something real, but I couldn't ignore it. I felt responsible for these people, even if we weren't an official group. Later that day, we found another decent spot to camp. It was slightly protected by trees, so we set up there. But Spider still wouldn't relax. Every so often, he'd lift his head suddenly and stare toward the tree line, completely alert. It was chilling, watching him react to something we couldn't see or hear. The group's mood had shifted. Everyone was tense. Sounds that used to be background noise now felt like potential threats. I've spent enough time in the woods to know the difference between a regular forest sound and something that doesn't belong. And something didn't belong. I told everyone I wasn't comfortable staying, But we'd camp there for the night, and as soon as the sun rose, we'd head toward the nearest village and try to get a ride back to our cars. Everyone agreed. Nobody had any idea how much worse that night would get. Around 1 a.m., we started hearing noises in the distance, like several people running through the woods. I froze. I couldn't tell what the hell was happening. I looked at Spider, waiting for his reaction, but he just lifted his head, alert but not aggressive. I told everyone to grab whatever protection they had, and they didn't hesitate. Not even 2 minutes later, the family we'd met on the first night came crashing into our camp, crying and screaming that they were being chased. They looked like they'd been through hell. The girls were sobbing, clinging to their parents, who looked nothing like the calm couple we'd met before. It took a while to calm them down enough to get an explanation, and when they finally told us, I couldn't believe it. They said they were being hunted by feral people. My first instinct was to dismiss it. Sure, I'd heard the rumors, the legends, but I never believed any of it. Still, there was no doubt in my mind that something had chased them. But feral people? We decided to take turns keeping watch so the family could rest. Matt and I took the first shift, along with Spider. Everything was quiet, until suddenly, Spider went back into full defense mode, fur raised, eyes locked on the forest. But we couldn't see or hear anything. I stepped forward, flashlight in one hand and my weapon in the other. As I got closer to the tree line, I felt something claw into my arm. Sharp fingernails digging into my skin. I turned and there was a face, one I still can't describe, pressed up close to mine. It belonged to whatever those claws were attached to. I must have screamed because within seconds Matt was behind me and Spider was attacking whatever it was. That thing let out this horrifying sound and took off running. That's when we saw them. Multiple figures emerging from the woods. Some ran upright like people, but others moved on all fours. The way they moved, it wasn't human. It was wild, animalistic. We grabbed everything and hiked through the night to higher ground where we managed to get a signal and call for help. At dawn, rangers showed up, fully geared. But when we told them what had happened, when we said, without a doubt, we'd been attacked by feral people, they just looked at each other and told us we were wrong. They said it must have been some kind of animal, nothing more. I didn't have the strength to argue. I just wanted out. None of us said a word. Only me, Matt, and that family had seen what we saw. And the rangers? I think they knew. I think they've always known. But for some reason, they didn't want us to believe it. I never went looking for answers after that. I spent months in a fog of denial and numbness. But that fog has lifted, and now, I need to know. I need to know what attacked us that night in the Smokey Mountains.